I remember the first time I watched my friend play Final Fantasy VII. He had gotten it, along with a PlayStation, for his 13th birthday, only a few days after my own. Up to that point, both of us had been dyed-in-the-wool Nintendo fanboys, and I recall his initial disappointment that he hadn't received a Nintendo 64. This disappointment did not last very long. The game was immersive and impressive. Even in the brief window of watching someone else play it for an hour or so, during a raucous party for a bunch of teenagers, augmented with caffeine and far too much sugar. The impression that brief glimpse of gameplay left on me was indelible. I can still recall at the time my initial reticence about the game being offered. It was a time when marketing for video games required commercials that aired on television, as there were few other media available outside gaming magazines, which were inherently for the already initiated. The high-fidelity FMVs, bombastic background music, and deep-throated narrator proclaiming that this marvel of cinematic wonder would never be coming to a theater near you was, even for my adult 14-year-old brain, a bit much. Of course the FMVs were going to be amazing and wonderful. It was an advertisement. It was the cutscenes. What was the actual gameplay like? Why weren't you showing that? I demanded of the narrator, as we never got to see it. Of course, in retrospect, the advertisement actually featured a considerable percentage of non-FMV material. Just wait, I thought, until you see the majesty of Mario and the awesome power of the Nintendo 64. That night, that moment, something changed. And yes, it is wholly the opening FMV that really hooked me. An infinite starscape and eerie otherworldly hum transitioning to the delicately lit face of a girl. It stirred something in me. I can even now still hear the echoes of her footsteps as she slowly walked out of the alleyway, emerging into the bluster of Midgar, before the music swelled and the camera panned to the top of Shinra Tower, the game's logo flashing across the screen in all its black and turquoise glory, then quickly transitioning to a train screeching to a halt, and the game getting underway. Our nameless hero emerging from the train and engaging in his first fight. That sword! What was I even looking at? Up to this point, my frame of reference for swords had been the Sword of Omens, Power Sword, Leonardo's swords, and of course lightsabers. How even was someone using such a gigantic weapon? Giant swords? How freaking cool was that? I would, in no short order, become myself enraptured with this game, its spiky-haired protagonist and his massive sword. Final Fantasy VII would come to dominate the next several months of my life. Each school project, work of fan art, the waking hours spent analyzing strategy guides, exploring in-universe lore. Hundreds of hours of gameplay, an obsession that would only gradually fade, but which would reverberate throughout my life, opening myself to fandom and gaming culture in a way I had never experienced before. And the sword. The sword stayed with me. With the remake just released, this video assumes familiarity with the plot of Final Fantasy VII and subsequent compilation properties, so spoilers ahead for those who are just getting into the series. Go back, play Remake, about 35 hours or so, you should be good. The Buster Sword, a retrospective. Part 1. What am I looking at? The Buster Sword is, like most iconic weapons, visually striking but conceptually simple. It is a giant sword. It is a single-edged, exceptionally wide and thick blade terminating in what would be called a tanto point. There is a clear temper line, or hamon, between the edge and bulk of the blade itself. It features a hilt slightly wider than the blade, reminiscent of what are currently called spatha from the Migration and later early medieval period. It lacks any kind of crossguard or quillon because the blade itself shelters the wielder's hands. The handle is also very long, terminating in a simple pommel cap. Also notable are the two large holes through the forked blade. They're for equipping materia. In some of the earliest sketches for a much smaller version of the Buster Sword, there is a single hole which actually acts as the point of suspension to mount the sword on Cloud's back. Some of the promotional artwork also shows significant wear on the blade, and this is a feature which will be carried forward in subsequent adaptations. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I will not be discussing speculative dimensions, weights, how gravity works in Gaia, and other related details. There are innumerable YouTube videos already dedicated to this topic, and they are far better produced than what you're about to see. What kind of sword is the Buster Sword supposed to be? Well, in the original manual, the type of weapon Cloud is listed as using is simply swords, so that's not much help. In Remake, this is changed to broadsword, and while there is some merit to calling it that, no historic European broadsword bears any semblance to the Buster Sword. In Western parlance of Chinese sword typologies, however, colloquially, many Dao and Dao derivations are called Chinese broadswords, delineating them against Jian or Gim. This does turn back onto European nomenclature, as broadswords were delineated from small swords, and so this naming convention sort of stuck. Developmentally, when Tetsuya Nomura began to brainstorm and develop the initial character of Cloud, he was developed with a foil in mind, Sephiroth. This duality is very important, as it forms the thematic core of the main plot and extends into the weapon design of both characters. The historic inspirations for Cloud and Sephiroth were Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro, or Ganryu, depending on which source you're relying on. Musashi's Musha Shugyo, or Warrior's Pilgrimage, traditionally climaxed with his duel against Sasaki on the island of Ganryu. This is mirrored in the game, of course, with the final duel against Sephiroth. Sasaki traditionally wielded a sword called Mono Ho Shizao, or clothes drying pole, for which the Edo period was a longer than average okatana. This was the inspiration for the Masamune, albeit this would more properly be called an odachi or nodachi, but these kind of swords have been out of fashion since the end of the 14th century. Musashi, as tradition goes, decided to counter this by either using an oar, in Okinawan Kubudo this is called an iku, or carving a subarito out of an oar, while traveling in boat to the island. The historical liability of this latter account is doubtful. Wakizashi, which was the kind of blade Musashi was likely to have had on his person, is not especially well suited to wood carving, and so it is likely that Musashi would have either used an oar or a long pole of some kind. Thus, the Buster Sword was, at least as a concept, based off of the eku or subarito, as opposed to any extant historic swords. Nomura's initial design, in fact, was little more than a hunk of metal, more paddle than sword-like. It wasn't until later in the development process that the Buster Sword as we know it took shape. Now, Nomura wasn't designing in a vacuum, and so other clear inspirations for the Buster Sword would be the dragon-slaying sword wielded by Gatsu in the manga Berserk, designed by Kentaro Miura. There are just too many similarities to be coincidental, but nevertheless, it is cool that both can be iconic in their own way. Part 2. Iconography. I think a very strong argument could be made that Final Fantasy VII is the first time in the series that an object that wasn't a crystal, but rather a weapon, became the most iconic aspect of that game. Even the silhouette of the Buster Sword was instantly recognizable and could immediately tell you that the person was into Final Fantasy VII. This was different. This was new. The box, or in this case, case art, for the game itself was the first hint. It features Cloud, hand gripping the handle of the Buster Sword, as he stands in the foreground looking at Shinra Tower. In terms of gameplay, the start menu followed suit. A black screen, the words Start and Continue, suspended above a softly illuminated Buster Sword. And that was it. Of course, if you waited, the prelude would kick in and the image would shift, but the first image you see, that you would see each and every time that you started the game up, was the Buster Sword. Weapons in the Final Fantasy games up to this point had been disposable, temporary items in your inventory that would be discarded the moment something better was available. I mean, yeah, you could hold on to them and then use like toss and other abilities later on, but for the most part, you'd use it till it was no longer valuable, and then either sell it or never think about it again. Sure, even now you could easily name the Ultima Weapon, Man-Eater, Gungear, Holy Lance, but it wasn't until Final Fantasy VII that the weapons you used became inextricably linked to the iconography of the game itself. This is also a pattern that can be easily seen in subsequent titles, Final Fantasy VIII, 10, 13, and even to some extent 15. Most feature iconic armaments used by its titular protagonist, most often as initial equipment to boot. Why though? Why was it that suddenly we were supposed to care about the initial, albeit really cool looking, equipment that would undoubtedly be replaced as soon as we were able? The simple answer is, of course, that the developers wanted us to. The promotional artwork, the game's North American case art, the character bios within the game manual, even the concept sketches, all featured this understandably weird, enormous sword-like object as a major point of focus. Visual media relish in shorthand, and if a sword of ridiculous proportions was being carried around and wielded, often single-handedly no less, by our spiky-haired protagonist, then we knew that we had a badass in our hands. From a pragmatic angle, the developer's decision to actually have the model of our main character use his weapon outside of the pre-rendered battle sequences added a level of world building and depth that had been all but absent during previous iterations of the series, let alone other RPGs. The ability to render with high enough fidelity to incorporate items outside of the player's own body meant that those pre-rendered cutscenes required a degree of continuity. Sure, we could see Cloud actually hold his weapon, but this stopped short of being able to effectively replace that weapon with other, newer equipment. That was just too much for the technology to bear, and there are many good videos out there talking about the nightmare that was the production and programming of Final Fantasy VII. So how do you deal with a player's proclivity to empty their inventories and trade up as soon as possible? You make the default equipment impossible to move out of your inventory. This way, even if your player didn't actually have it equipped, it was still present in your item menu. Thus, with the slightest glossing over, the suspension of disbelief required to swap out your current weapon for your default was easily achieved. As a related feature, make sure that you have to keep your initial weapon for a long time during gameplay. From the moment Cloud exits the Midgar Express to shimmying down a rope off the highway, you will spend the first 10 or so hours of Final Fantasy VII exploring the city of Midgar. You can purchase new armor several times while in Midgar, but you are not able to buy a new sword for Cloud until you arrive in the next town, Calm. It is true that you can obtain a new sword for Cloud by stealing it from an enemy in the upper echelon of the Shinra Tower. The Heart Edge can be stolen from a soldier 3rd class, and even appears in some of the promotional artwork featuring Cloud riding the Hardy Daytona motorcycle, but you have to go out of your way to do so. As such, the expectation of the developers for your first playthrough is to spend 10 hours or so with the Buster Sword. Even the latter swords, as nifty as Ultima Weapon is, fail to capture or supplant the bond you have established with Cloud and his Buster Sword, as both later gameplay, as well as future installments in the series, will emphasize. I'm not going to recount all the times you see Cloud use the Buster Sword, but the last time it is used in-game, outside of places like the Golden Saucer, the G-Bike game, or the Battle Arena, is when Cloud almost kills Aerith, prior to Sephiroth doing it himself. I don't know if that's significant, if it was a deliberate aspect consciously inserted by the developers, and you could easily spiral out into a Zack stopped him, couldn't use it against Aerith kind of fan theory deal. But this isn't really the place for speculation. At least not about that. Similarly, the last time Cloud is shown holding the Buster Sword in-game, outside the flashbacks to Nibelheim and the cutscene which reveal the fate of Zack, it is during Tifa's coma following the events in the Northern Crater. We watch as Cloud slowly walks away, dragging the Buster Sword behind him. If I was a programmer, and with all the hindsight, this would have been a really good point to actually remove the Buster Sword from its permanent slot in the inventory. Thematically, Cloud being lost, overwhelmed with the deception that his memories have been manipulated into believing himself to be a failed Sephiroth clone, can only be made stronger with the loss of the weapon that established him as an ex-soldier. So to reiterate, the game, in both narration and gameplay, does a lot to establish the importance of the Buster Sword, and we as players are made to associate Cloud so strongly with the Buster Sword that if you saw a Cloud cosplayer, and he or she didn't have some version of the Buster Sword, admit it, you'd be a little disappointed. Part 3. Buster Sword Lore. Branding was becoming more relevant to the way that games were being produced, and Final Fantasy VII was an early adapter of the use of game mechanics to enhance the iconography of its fictionalized world. Being able to discard an item from your inventory wasn't a new phenomenon. Key items have always been staples of the franchise since its inception. But this was really the first to me that initial equip and the earliest weapons was neither sellable nor disposable. The basis was also not bound to later combat mechanics. For example, you acquired initial equipment to upgrade or unlock some endgame ultimate weapon, but rather the internal cohesion of the narrative itself, and it is only after Cloud finally rediscovers his identity and the truth behind Nibelheim that we no longer see the Buster Sword. But by this late in the game, it has already left its mark, despite not using it as a weapon since the raid on Shinra Tower. In fact, the last time the Buster Sword is seen in-game is the optional cutscene that occurs upon returning to the lab in the basement of Shinra Mansion, once Cloud has figured out who he is, and discovering the ultimate fate of Zack. The link to Zack, and that the Buster Sword was decidedly not Cloud's weapon, but Cloud as Zack's weapon, would be further expanded upon and reinforced in what would come to be called Compilation of Final Fantasy VII, which is where we turn our attention to next. Crisis Core. The origins of the Buster Sword, at least in terms of an in-universe, non-developmental origin, like many elements, were created for Crisis Core. In this case, the Buster Sword is introduced as the weapon of Angeal Hewley, and is heavily weighted to his character motivation and development. The Buster Sword is a gift from Angeal's stepfather, an extravagant investment to the point that Angeal rarely uses it, wishing to keep it from harm. As such, while the sword is indeed Angeal's, it is really Zack who fully uses it as it was intended to be, as a weapon. Zack is entrusted with the sword by Angeal just before he dies. Zack inherits the symbol of Angeal's code of honor, if not literally his spirit. Crisis Core is not subtle in its symbolism. Zack continues to wield the Buster Sword throughout the rest of the game, until the game begins to sync up with the backstory of Final Fantasy VII proper. Zack and Cloud become fast friends, they travel to Nibelheim, Sephiroth discovers his true nature and becomes a living embodiment of an environmental existential crisis thanks to late capitalism. A Marxist reading of Final Fantasy VII, coming soon. And you know the rest. Except the time skip. The time skip of being experimented upon for 5 years straight was an odd choice. Anyway, Zack and Cloud escape. Some more extra narrative events happen which ties directly into Dirge Cerberus, and finally we come to the climax of the story, Zack's last stand. Where in the original flashback, Zack is murked by a handful of Shinra troops, this time he gets to literally fight an entire army of Shinra troops, simply being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Zack falls. Cloud comes out of his Mako-induced delirium at just the right time for Zack, with his dying breath, to pass on the Buster Sword to Cloud. This transmission continues the established theme from this game, but also ties directly into the delusion which motivates Cloud throughout the first half of Final Fantasy VII, as we see him go directly into Soldier Mode. As much as the iconography of the series places the Buster Sword in Cloud's hands, narratively, the sword really is Zack's. Keeping in mind that each time we see or participate in a flashback to the Nibelheim incident, it is really Zack's experiences that are being played out. Or at least Cloud's memory of watching Zack. As I've previously mentioned, in terms of narration, the Buster Sword acts as a crutch, which Cloud clings to in order to maintain the illusory life he continues to lead during the events of the original game, at least until he regains his memories. This theme is, I think, concluded during the event of the next title in the series, well, chronologically earlier but later in the compilation continuity, Advent Children. the Buster Sword is not really used in battle by Cloud during the events of Advent Children. Instead, the Buster Sword has been replaced by the Fusion Sword, a weapon comprised of 6 individual weapons. First Sword does slightly resemble the original concept design of the Buster Sword. Hollow Blade, which has features resembling some additional early concepts of the Buster Sword. Back Blades, 2 identical swords. Side Blades, 2 smaller folding short swords. Interestingly enough, in some earlier release footage for the film, Cloud was intended to still wield the Buster Sword, but ultimately the decision was made to retire it and have Cloud use the new Buster Sword-shaped Fusion Sword instead. I'd again suggest that there is an argument to be made that narratively, as the Buster Sword is unmistakably Zack's weapon, that it was the right call to have Cloud literally use it as a grave marker for Zack, to show that he had moved on and developed past his trauma and has his eye on the future. Before we get to the obvious next phase, I did want to mention briefly one franchise outside the compilation which has added to the continued development and iconography of the Buster Sword. Kingdom Hearts. Cloud's cameo was probably the most exciting of the Square characters that appear in the first Kingdom Hearts game for me. Sorry, Squall fanboys. And his redesign was novel and, if nothing else, a huge hit with cosplayers. For those not familiar, Cloud is slightly antagonistic during the main playthrough, and then becomes an optional opponent that can teach Sora a new technique and unlock the Steel Chocobo Blade, which has some distinctive Buster Sword characteristics. The Buster Sword in this case is shown to be significantly longer than previous, as well as subsequent, renditions, albeit it is also wrapped in tattered bandages. It's actually a common trope with giant swords. For example, the Zanba blade is shown in the manga and anime series Rurouni Kenshin. The bandages represent Cloud's emotional state. See, he's damaged, folks, and so the bandages represent bandages. Again, subtlety is not something Square is particularly good at. Anyway, the important bit that made me rush this to take as much advantage of the algorithm as I possibly could. Remake. I'm obviously dating myself here, but at this point in history, we are now in the shadow of the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake. The game will be released in multiple parts. Part 1, released on April 9th, 2020, will narratively follow the events of the original game to the fight with Motorball and the party's departure from Midgar. Thus, gameplay will be entirely within Midgar. This raises an interesting question. Given that in the original, you can steal the hard edge towards the end of the first raid on Shinra Tower, otherwise you don't have access to a weapon for Cloud until you reach the town of Kalm, as I discussed earlier. This also again works mechanically to reinforce the iconography of the Buster Sword. With that said, we do know that multiple weapons will be made available for each character, carrying over many of the weapons from the original game. One of the newer features of weapon mechanics is that weapons will be able to be leveled up, as each weapon appears to have a skill tree that is expanded the more the individual weapon is used. This seems to be linked to each weapon having a strategic basis when deployed, depending on the enemy type, reminiscent of Final Fantasy XIII to be sure. In terms of the design of the Buster Sword, it is similar design to the versions we've seen in both Advent Children and Crisis Core, with the distinctive etched lines near the fort of the blade. One of the distinctions, however, is that the blade has been made significantly thinner than most previous renditions. It also appears to rely on a magnetic harnessing system which allows Cloud to mount the sword to his back, though the mechanics are unclear at this point as to how he would engage and disengage said magnet. When things were much more speculative, I was hoping for the Buster Sword to be an exclusive weapon, given its significance throughout the original game and expanded compilation canon, everything I've essentially just said. What an opportunity to actually just reinforce that. Given that leveling weapons does seem to be a feature of Remake, I'm kind of hoping that you will be able to run through the entirety of the game with the Buster Sword as a reasonable, and not run, option. We will have to wait and see. Nevertheless, it does seem likely the original iconography will be enforced, as you will be spending a significant part of this game, of Part 1, using the Buster Sword. Part 4. Miscellany and sundry. Sword Master Buster Sword Replica. I don't want to get into merchandising too much. It could be a video in its own right, but it isn't particularly where my interests lie. I did, however, want to mention one early and decidedly late 90s, early aughts offering, which was essentially the only one that was available at the time, albeit ultimately quite underwhelming. Given the much wider state of wallhanger productions and YouTube-based pop culture blacksmiths today, the uniqueness of the Swordmaster Buster Sword is worth mentioning. Just look at it. This was basically the only option if you wanted a real Buster Sword, and it's just enough like it, but scaled somewhat smaller, that you ultimately being really excited to have it until it sort of dawns on you that this cost you a tidy sum, and it's just not quite a good enough replica to justify that cost. The early aughts were a wild time to be a fan of Final Fantasy VII, and I have a feeling some of that energy is going to return again. Gaming has developed a lot since 1997. How well will Remake be received by fans of compilation, of gamers more broadly, and the general audience? For the longest time, no one wanted to touch the idea of remaking Final Fantasy VII with a 10-foot-long clothes-drying pole. I think a case could be made that the increasing success of the compilation materials in the wake of the original release played some small part in getting the ball rolling. However, the greatest contributing factor was surely the media landscape of the last 5 years. Mega franchises and nostalgia dominate theater, gaming, and television. The idea of taking a beloved but aged property, shying it up and selling it to nostalgic fans and new fans alike is simply the way that media gets produced these days. So the next couple of years will, for good or ill, make an interesting time to once again be a fan of Final Fantasy VII. This is awkward, but I don't have a PS4, so I haven't played the demo, let alone the game proper. So, I don't know, shed a tear for 14-year-old me as I have largely aged out of gaming? I mean, I have every intention of getting it like a used PS4 off Kijiji and buying a copy of Remake, maybe even before Part 2 is released. So, for those of you who can, enjoy the game. I hope you found this video interesting, and I invite your feedback in the comments below. Please like and share the video if you think it is merited. If you want to see when I publish new content, subscribe to the channel. Hey, want to see what else I've done? It isn't a lot right now. Gonna have a link appearing above somewhere. Thanks for your time.